So let's think about flood stories. Flood stories are kind of like creation stories and apocalypse stories all rolled into one, right? There's an apocalypse that wrecks everything and kills everybody. And then out of that scourge, and all life is scraped off the earth, out of that comes the seed of the new creation. You know, in the Bible, Noah becomes the new Adam after the flood ends. So it's obviously a deeply moving psychological and soulful archetype. How human beings kind of reckon with the fact that sometimes things go sideways and they end. Were there real floods that sparked these storytellers? Of course. Did an isthmus break, flooding a valley and putting their whole village under 30 feet of water forever? Yes, stuff like that happens in the world as the planet shifts around. And so, of course, there, on one hand, might be factual events of local cataclysmic floods. We certainly still see this today, that sparked storytellers to tell these stories of global floods. So there's no reason to leave that aside. We are a storytelling species, and we take real events in our lives and we weave them into meaningful, soulful tales that perform, those functions that we've been talking about, the metaphysical, the cosmological, etc., functions of myth. And water is a particularly powerful metaphor, isn't it? We are made of water. The planet is covered with water. We spend the first 9 months of our life floating in water. Water gives us life as we drink it, as it irrigates our crops. So all ancient people would have recognized the magical, life-giving powers of water, that yes, it can kill you. That's the yang, but the yin of it is it also, makes possible new life. And to think about Carl Jung, since we mentioned archetypes, just for one more moment here, in Jungian psychology, water is often held as a symbol of the unconscious. Like if you have dreams of water, they used to do a lot of dream interpretation, right? Not so popular anymore, but back in the early 20th century, mid-20th century, when Jung and Freud were still alive, people thought dreams had great, symbolic meaning. Now we're not so sure, but it might just be some noise cooking up with emotional meaning. But anyway, water was often interpreted as the unconscious. Above the surface, you can kind of see and live and breathe. Below the surface, it's mysterious down there. But is that where the archetypes come from? Is that the collective unconscious from which all of these ideas come? So water is a very potent image to put into a story of destruction and then eventual rebirth that comes out of these flood stories. Let me just think about two of them with you today that are about 1,000 years apart. The first one is the Mesopotamian / Babylonian / Sumerian flood myth from the Epic of Gilgamesh, and we'll focus on the Babylonian version, which names its protagonist Utnapishtim. So we're going to get into him and Gilgamesh in a second here. And that, we believe, was written around 2000 BCE, so 4,000 years ago, 2000 BCE. And in that story, very, very roughly, there's a guy called Utnapishtim, and the gods cause there to be a flood, but one of the gods tells Utnapishtim, build a boat and load up some stuff on it. The other gods are going to try to kill you and everybody. And so one family is told by one of the gods to build an ark, and he does, and to very specific dimensions and a lot of detail. And Utnapishtim does this and builds the ark, and survives the flood and so on. And in the second flood, and we'll come back to that, the second flood story I want to look at is, of course, the most famous one that you all know about, and that is the one in the Bible, in the book of Genesis, chapters 6, 7, 8, 9. And so this is about Noah and Noah's ark or boat. And that story was written 1,000 years after the Epic of Gilgamesh. So by the time the Hebrews come along and tell their story, the Epic of Gilgamesh, just a couple hundred miles down the road there, the Epic of Gilgamesh is already a well-established 1,000-year-old myth that's been floating around for a while. So we're going to wonder about the connection between these two stories. But as you know, these aren't the only two flood stories. Wherever you go in the world, China, Mesoamerica, Africa, everywhere, there are stories of these primordial, cleansing, destructive, and ultimately regenerative floods. So these are the two we're looking at, though. Now in Genesis, kind of a similar deal, right? In that case, God tells Noah, I'm going to flood the world and kill everybody, but I'm picking you to build a boat, to survive, to have your family and all the animals and all that stuff survive. So on the surface, they're like really similar stories. So let's kind of think a little bit more carefully about each of them and how to compare and contrast. So compare means find the similarities, and contrast means find the differences. Well, the similarities are easy. There's a flood. The god or the gods pick one man, one family to be saved, to be the new seed of life after the destruction. They both give very careful blueprint for how to build the boat, like the dimensions and the size, and they also give specific directions about what to put on the boat. The animals 2 by 2, and I guess it's a difference, but in the epic they tell them bring some money, bring some gold. You're going to need money, and that's not mentioned in the biblical story. But back to the similarities. The flood lasts for a while, different lengths of time, and then the boats kind of hit some dirt, they land, and the flood ends and begins to recede. And in both stories, Utnapishtim in the epic and Noah in Genesis, they get off the boat, they build an altar, they build a ritual to God, they make a sacrifice to the gods or to God. And also how they discovered that the land was dry by sending birds, crows and ravens and doves. That's the same in both stories as well. So a lot of similarities there. It really makes you wonder why they're so similar. How did that happen? Now let's think about the differences, because here was where they really split apart. The most obvious difference is polytheism and monotheism. Yeah, the Babylonians and the Sumerians, they're polytheistic. They have tons of gods. In fact, that's the problem, is the gods are kind of warring between themselves, and some of the gods decide to have a flood and kill people, kill everybody. And one of the gods breaks rank, and he goes and he tells Noah, he kind of like rats out the gods. That's how, sorry, no, I said Noah, I mean Utnapishtim. That's how Utnapishtim is saved, because one of the gods broke the silence of the gods and came down and leaked the story and saved this guy. So that's a difference, polytheism. In the Genesis story, of course, there's just God who by himself decides to do this. Now, what about the reason for the flood? That's really an interesting piece to me, right? And I don't know how much to make of this, but in the Babylonian version of the earlier Sumerian tale that we're calling the Epic of Gilgamesh, you have this character called Gilgamesh, who's kind of a jaded king, and he goes on this long trip. And the Sumerians didn't believe in immortality. They thought that you're just alive for a while and then you're dead and there's no afterlife. But in this story, the Epic of Gilgamesh, which we think of really as the first novel on Earth, the first narrative story with a protagonist who goes on a road trip, he goes on a quest journey. It's really the first story of its kind on the planet. And Gilgamesh meets a guy who is immortal. And that would be our friend Utnapishtim. So it's toward the end of the Epic of Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh sits down with Utnapishtim and Utnapishtim's wife, and they feed him and they have a chat. And Utnapishtim tells Gilgamesh this story because Utnapishtim's immortal. He's been alive forever. He's like, hey, like centuries and centuries ago, let me tell you what happened to me. There was this flood, blah, blah, blah. So that's where the flood story comes from in the Epic of Gilgamesh. It doesn't happen to Gilgamesh. It happened to Utnapishtim long ago. And he lives forever, so he's able to tell these stories from ancient primordial times. So in that story, yeah, the reason for the flood was the gods just didn't like us. They were pissed off at us. We were too noisy or something. Some trivial, dumb reason. And what about the Bible? What about Genesis? What happened there? In that story, it seems clear that God is very explicit. I mean, it says it right there in Genesis. God decides to kill all human beings because human beings are horrible. We're wicked. We're wretched. We're irredeemable, unfixable. Remember in the Popol Vuh we were talking about the wooden men? And there, the god of the Popol Vuh is like, these wooden men are terrible. They burn the bottoms of their cooking pots. They beat their dogs. They can't say my name. I'm going to send a flood and kill them all. It's really the same story here. God, many generations after Adam and Eve, I mean, it went wrong right away, didn't it? He made Adam and Eve, and then they screwed up and they ate the fruit, and out you go. You know, they got kicked out of paradise. And they had a bunch of kids, and many, many, many generations later, six chapters later in the book of Genesis, there's people presumably now. I don't know how many, but a bunch. And they're horrible people. And God's like, I'm going to kill them all. I'm just going to delete the hard drive. This is a total disaster. And I know that brings up great questions for us if we approach this story as Jews, as Christians, as Muslims. This is a terrible story of God creating a creature so broken that it has to be erased. I thought this was an all-knowing, perfect God. And I know the defense is, well, God gave us free will. It's not his fault we're so awful. Okay. You could take that stand, certainly, and many do. But it's still, the question still haunts us, does it not? That could not a perfect, all-powerful, all-knowing being make human beings that weren't quite so horrible? That they would all have to be erased in a global genocide. Like, that's your solution? Yes. But Noah, God thought was pretty cool. So he's like, Noah, build a boat, etc., get all the animals, survives the flood. And so similar reasons for the flood. The gods or God were angry with humanity and wanted to get rid of them. Here's another contrast I want to think about as we analyze these two stories. And as you read them both, you'll get a chance to see all this for yourself. There is also a curious scene in the Epic of Gilgamesh about how the gods react to the flood. Now, we'll compare this to how God in Genesis reacts to the flood as well. But in the epic, it's pretty clear. Once the flood gets going, it's stormy as hell, and everything's flooded, and the boat's floating around. Even the gods were afraid of the flood. They withdrew. They went up to the heaven of Anu. The gods cowered like dogs crouched by an outside wall. Ishtar, one of the main goddesses, Ishtar screamed like a woman giving birth. Agonizing screams. The mistress of the gods, sweet of voice, was wailing. Quote, has that time really turned to clay because I spoke evil in the gods' assembly? How could I have spoken such evil in the gods' assembly? I should have ordered a battle to destroy my people. I myself gave birth to them. They are my own people, yet they fill the sea like fish spawn. It is apparently Ishtar who led the charge to slaughter humankind with the flood. And now she's like, oh no, I wish I hadn't done that. This is terrible. Look at all their dead bodies floating in the sea. And she's in agony. You could really say she has great regret and remorse. In other words, these Sumerian, Babylonian gods are not all-knowing beings. They're not perfect beings. They don't know what they're doing. They're terribly human and flawed and violent and rash and capricious. So they ordered a flood, and now they're like, oh my God, the flood's so bad, even I'm scared of the flood. Kind of lame gods when you think about it. Now, let's get to the Genesis story. How does God react to the flood? Well, for one thing, he's not scared of the flood at all. But when the flood is over, God does an interesting thing. And I want to ask you, does it sound to you like God also regretted bringing this cataclysm on his creation that he made, humanity, that he made in his image, humanity? In Genesis chapter 8, verse 21, he says, after the flood is over, God says, I will not again curse the ground anymore for man's sake. For the imagination of man's heart is evil from his youth. Neither shall I again smite any more every living thing as I have done. So God basically looks at the damage of the flood and says, I won't do that again. And now I'm reading into it, right? See if you agree with me. That was a little too extreme. Maybe I got carried away. I kind of regret that I did that. I shouldn't have done that. I mean, isn't that what saying, I will never do that again means? Is, maybe I went too far. So it's still that question we've been chewing on in a couple of different videos now. Is the biblical God, the God of the Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition, is God perfect, immutable, and changeless? Or is God kind of a developmental and evolutionary God? There's something in theology called process theology, which suggests that God evolves and grows more and more God-like, more and more conscious, wiser and wiser. That's not the mainstream view, though, is it? In mainstream Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, the theology is clear. God is eternal, immutable, perfect, flawless, changeless. And yet when we see these creation, especially these flood stories, we see interesting scenes, interesting moments where God in his own word says, maybe that wasn't the right thing to do. So those are fascinating compare and contrasts that come up. So just to wrap up here, that question kind of is intriguing to me. Is God learning on the job, as he clearly was in the Popol Vuh? Now, in the Babylonian, Sumerian stuff, those gods, they don't learn anything, right? They're just like gangsters. They just wreck stuff, and then they're like, "Oh no, everything's wrecked." You're like, "Yeah, you just wrecked everything." That's what. So we don't look for a lot of wisdom from those Mesopotamian gods, but the whole pitch of the Bible is that this is a wise, loving God, and so you read these particular moments with fascination, where God himself seems to struggle with his own powers and how to wield them. And so finally, the cosmological function, we always land there, right? In our study of cosmic myths. That what vision of the cosmos do we get from this? Well, again, in the Babylonian, Mesopotamian, Sumerian stories, humanity's in a little trouble, because the gods are dangerous and the universe is a dangerous place. And the gods, they didn't even get together and think as a team, like they're fighting each other. And our hope is like, please don't notice us, please don't notice us. But in the biblical account, we have a different cosmology where God has a real clear covenant or contract with us. That if we love God and do what God asks of us, if we keep God's commandments, we're in good. It puts us in a good position, because God is a loving God, a safe God, who cares for us, who is wise, who is at least measured and at least somewhat restrained, even when he's blowing stuff up. Now, he did promise there in that passage I just read that he will never again curse the ground or harm anything. Later in the Bible, God still blows up towns. He still slaughters people. His prophets certainly slaughter people on his behalf. So there's lots of violence in the Hebrew Bible. There's no doubt about that. This is a time of war, and so war finds its way into the story. Why wouldn't it? So what kind of universe do we live in? And why do we love these creation stories and keep telling them over and over and over again? That's the question I keep coming back to as we recount these stories of cosmological floods, destructions, and the rebirth that follows. One of the things that the gods gave to Utnapishtim when he survived the flood was immortality. That was Utnapishtim's gift. Something none of the other people had. So he got magical superpowers from the gods for his acquiescence, his cooperation with the gods' plan, building the boat, surviving the flood. Let's talk about a rebirth, right? He came out much stronger on the other end. So all these details continue to enrich our enjoyment and the wisdom that we continue to try to wring out of these ancient stories. See you on the other side.